Thank you for joining me for this study of the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. This is session 1. The title is The Journey. The text is Numbers 9, verse 15 to 23. And the lesson summary statement is God gives daily guidance to his people. I'm going to start the lesson by telling about the astronaut Gordon Cooper. He was born just a short distance from here in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and they've named a Votech Center after him. And you can read about his story in Wikipedia to get something of an outline. He was one of the first 7 Mercury astronauts. He was the youngest that was picked. And if you've seen the movie The Right Stuff, the character Dennis Quaid is the one who played him in these 7 characters. He tells in his book, Leap of Faith, about his fear, his trepidation, the night before he goes into space. What they were doing with him is he was going to be the first astronaut that had spent at least 24 hours or longer in outer space. And NASA was trying to discover if it was possible for astronauts to actually live in space and make it to the moon and back. And so he was the first one to make that kind of effort. And it's a very interesting story about the difficulties he had in returning to Earth. Well, the book of Numbers, in a sense, could be titled The Leap of Faith, because Numbers is the story of Israel's leap of faith. Will they trust God? There's so many unknowns. Where are they going to camp? What are they going to eat and drink? Is the rock going to continue to provide water? Will manna still show up on the ground? How are they going to get there? Will they have success when they get there? There's so many unknowns, but there was one thing that was known, and that is God was going to be with them. And the way that is illustrated in the book of Numbers is the tabernacle. It is the symbol of God's presence in the midst of his people. And then the cloud is the demonstration of God's glory that would dwell in the midst of his people. So many unknowns, but the main thing, the most important thing was known, and that was God's presence. In times past, when I've introduced a book, I have used the Bible Project because it's creative and it's generally something I will agree with. And so I'm going to use the Bible Project demonstration. It's just over 6 minutes long, and the class seems to enjoy that. I also want them to know about it so that they can revisit it to get more information again or be refreshed in the book of Numbers, but also in their own personal studies. I think it has value. Now, if you'll note that there's an outline of Numbers that's in the personal study guide as well as in your leader's guide, and they break Numbers down into 7 points. But I'd like to break Numbers down into 3 points. For example, there's a geographical outline. It has the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, verses 1 to 10. And then secondly, in the wilderness, chapter 10 through chapter 25. And then in the plains of Moab, Numbers 26 to verse 36. There's also a generational outline that you could give that follows something like the geographical outline. There is the old generation, chapters 1 to 10, the tragic transition, chapters 10 to 25, where they're just one story after another of rebellion against God, and then the new generation, chapters 26 to 36. I also have another one of these video lessons on this very passage that was from a previous study out of the Explore the Bible that's on YouTube that you might want to listen to, and it'll have additional information as to what I'm giving here. I tried to write an entirely different lesson in case you wanted to use both of those. Now, the purpose of Numbers is to contrast the faithfulness of God to the lack of faith of his people. Because when you read Numbers, you're just stunned at the rebellion of these people and their disobedience to God. And yet God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a promise that he keeps. And yet his holiness demands a 40-year sentence for the disobedient to die off. So following God's guidance is a big deal. I want you to see in point number one, God's presence. God gives daily guidance to his people. I'm going to ask the class to read the text, and then I'm going to do something that I do with my grandchildren. When I'm at a restaurant, in order to entertain the grandchildren while we're waiting on our food, I'll take a napkin and we'll draw something like maybe an airplane or a car or something like that. And then we pass the napkin around to each grandkid and they get to add something to the picture. And oftentimes they'll have to explain what's happening. And by the time the food arrives, we've pretty much messed up that napkin and it's really ridiculous and humorous about what we've made out of that plane or that car or something like that. And so I'm going to do that with my class. I'm going to have someone come and draw a picture of this scene. And so maybe someone comes and draws the tent. And then I'll ask somebody else to come and draw something else about the scene. And until maybe I've gone through the class, if it's small or a number of people. But what I'm wanting to do is as they draw something about the scene, I want us to talk about it. For example, the tabernacle. It says in verse 15, on the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of testimony, and it appeared like fire above the tabernacle from evening until morning. Well, there's a time to talk about the tabernacle, and we can see that the tabernacle was the dwelling of God. That's what the word tabernacle means. It means to dwell. And we'll talk about that, the significance of that, the fact that it's in the center of the camp, and that the tents are all facing towards the tabernacle, and that it's arranged in a certain way, the tribes are, in order to proceed when it comes time to move. Then there is the cloud, and you can talk about the cloud here, and the fact that it represents the appearance of God. The word cloud occurs over 80 times in the Old Testament, and the vast majority of those occurrences refers to the supernatural element of the cloud that designated God's presence. I heard that there's not too many clouds in the desert. They'll have clouds, when a weather pattern's moving over, but the desert doesn't have bodies of water that is helpful in producing clouds, and they don't have large what are called biomasses, like forests that would produce moisture. And so by and large, the desert is cloudless. And yet here's this unique distinction of a cloud in a desert that guides God's people. And so there are a number of things about the cloud that you can point out. Notice something else about this passage is chronologically it's out of place. The tabernacle has already been built. What's happened is this event follows the second time they take the Passover. Now it's the cloud that leads them out of and protects them when they get out of Egypt. It protects them from the Egyptian army and as they cross over the Red Sea. So there is a Passover and then there's a cloud event. And so what happens in Numbers 9, again, you have a Passover. This is the second Passover. They've been at Mount Sinai almost a year, about 10 months. And then there's this second Passover. And then what happens? There is this cloud event. It signifies the presence of God. The commentators say, as we go through the text, I'm just taking the opportunity as they draw things to talk about and set the event that is happening here. The commentators say that the emphasis of these verses is on the constant presence of the cloud. God not only dwelt with Israel, they say that what Moses is telling us is that he is constantly revealing his presence with this ever-present cloud. And one of the most profound teachings of the Bible is the promise of God's continuing presence. God's continuing presence is pictured as transformative. We begin the Bible in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, and in the cool of the evening, God comes and he walks with Adam and Eve. They are in the presence of God. And they lose that because of sin. And the whole story of the Bible is them learning how, finding a way that God provides for them to come back into the presence of God. So when you come to the end of the Bible, man is with God again. But then you have passages all through the Bible that are famous for the presence of God. Psalms 23, verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Jesus, before he ascends into the presence of the Father, and according to Matthew, the last word that he gives before, as he commissions them to take the good news to the world, is, I will be with you even to the end of the age. So this issue of the presence of God is so powerful, so transformative. So let's just take for a moment and list what are some of the uncertainties that Israel's going to face. And one of the things I'm looking for is, and I've made reference to this, is the provision. They're not certain that there's going to be provisions. How about protection? They're in a dangerous place and they're among dangerous people. There is success. There no sign that they're going to be successful in their endeavors. And then there are going to be the losses that they face, the loss of lives and the loss of everything they possibly left behind in Egypt. And then there will be grief in their future, just what all of us experience. Now, can you think of any Old Testament characters or New Testament characters that illustrate the uncertainty that you've listed on the board, and how God's presence sustained them? Well, let's take this idea of provision. There's the prophet Elijah, and how God provided him bread at the brook when there was the famine and that came upon the land. And then, of course, there's protection, and we have many of the stories of David being protected from Saul as he sought out his life. Then there's this issue of success, and Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, in which God told Jeremiah, you will not be a success, but I will never abandon you. And then there are stories of loss and grief. Those are things in our future. And what do we have that speaks to us about that? And it's Job. Job had tremendous loss. He had tremendous grief, but he never lost the Lord. So how would an awareness of God have transformed their behavior in the in the wilderness? As Israel's making their journey, how would an unmistakable conviction of the presence of God helped them? And the things I'm looking for is it would have given them courage when they were fearful. It would have helped them to trust God when they were anxious. A conviction, a confidence of the presence of God would have caused them to be dependent on the Lord when they were needy. It's those kinds of things that I'm looking for in talking about the presence of God. And that brings us to the question, what is your need now? And how would you respond if you were greatly aware of the presence of God? So the first point is God's presence. God gives daily guidance to his people. The second point is faithful direction. Faithful direction. Now let me read the text, I say to the class, and then tell me what is the simple idea that God's communicating. So I read verses 17 through 22, and then or 21, and then I simply ask the class, what's the simple idea that is being said here? And it's really simple. When the cloud lifts and moves, you move with it. When the cloud settles and stops, you stop and stay there. And don't move. Don't leave until the cloud lifts and moves again. I mean, it's very simple. But what's so interesting about this passage is he takes verse 17 through 21 to simply state that passage. So what's going on in this? Well, let's dig into the details of the text a little bit more. First of all, the scholars say that what's happening here is there in the grammar there's almost a lyrical quality to it. There's parallelism taking place. For example, the cloud lifts and they set out. The cloud stops. The Israelites camp, and the Lord commands them to set out, and the Lord commands them to camp. And so there's this play back and forth between it lifts, then they're supposed to go, they're commanded to go. It stops, and they're commanded to stay. But they say, the scholars say that there's like I said, a poetic quality, almost as if this was a song. And so they say that maybe what was taking place in these verses is the people are singing these passages. And it is a reflection of the joy and the delight that they have in obeying God. And I was thinking about some of the hymns that we sing. We sing Victory in Jesus. It's a uplifting kind of hymn. And maybe what's happening in this text, according to the grammar, the scholars tell us, is that there is a joyous note about what they're singing in terms of their obedience to God. Now notice, it also says that it's very clear who's leading the people of Israel. It is God that is guiding them, and they are following him joyously. Notice the uniqueness of the fact that it says that God is in their midst. That is something we just simply assume, but that was very unusual for the people of Moses' day. They didn't talk about the gods in their midst accompanying them as is described here. This made Israel very unique. Notice in verse 19, even when the cloud stayed over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites carried out the Lord's requirement and did not set out. Now the word requirement there is not the word for command, but it's a different word. It has the idea of responsibility and duty and service and obligation to guard or to watch. And the word carried out is a word that has the meaning of guard duty. So what are they supposed to do when they are waiting? He says they are to be on guard. They are to be watchful. They're to be protective of the tabernacle. The way that God arranged them was to be not only to have the tabernacle in the center of the camp, which was talk about his priority, but it was also to be protective. And then on the inside ring of the camp, the tribes, were the Levites camping around the outer wall that had been constructed so that they would be protective. And so what is it that they're supposed to do? They're to be guarding. They're to be watching. Now think about this. When God has you and me in a holding pattern, we sometimes chafe about that. We want to do something. Well, there is something for us to do. We are to watch our walk with God. We're to watch our relationship with God. What is it that we're supposed to do when God has us in a waiting period, a waiting pattern? We're to deal with our sin. We're to protect our spiritual life. We're to reevaluate the priority that God has in our life. And so the waiting time is just as valuable as the walking time. Notice something else about this. It's unpredictable when they're supposed to move. He doesn't give any pattern. They don't have, you're going to see in a moment, they sometimes wait an evening. They camp. Can you imagine all of those people moving and you camp one evening? I mean, you can't have gotten very far with that number of people. And then they camp and then they move again. But sometimes it was 2 days, and we'll see sometimes it was a month and sometimes longer. But the point of it is they were to live with a sense of sensitivity and awareness. They were to keep an eye on that cloud. Now, some have said that, the rabbis have said that there were a group of Levites who were given the responsibility. Can you imagine this? And all they did all day long was watch that cloud. And the first moment that it moved, they had built these trumpets that they would sound to announce to the people it was time to move. They had 2 of them. One of them was a call to move, and the other was a call to war when they sounded out both of those. So there's the idea of sensitivity. Now, what I'm saying is I'm wanting to go through the details of this text. For example, another detail, in verse 21, it says, the cloud lifted in the morning. And the word lifted there is a passive form, which means the cloud was acted on to perform the action. The cloud didn't make that decision itself. And it's emphasizing that it's God that's initiating this. And so if God's initiating it, then we need to obey the command to move. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations that are unpleasant. We don't like it. We want to move on. But for whatever reasons, God has not lifted it off of us. And we are there. And God is leaving us there for certain reasons. And I would suggest you go back to 19. It is for us to be watchful. Watchful for Him in developing a sensitivity to His Spirit as well as a repentant spirit towards sin. There's much in there, and I'm sure you'll want to share with your class. Now that's the woods, but I want you to see the forest. You notice the point says faithful direction. The word faithful could mean reliable, and the word direction is your aim or your purpose. So He's giving them reliable purpose. And so you're either doing something according to this text, or you're waiting on further development. And God is speaking in this text to generations without a cloud. Now, these people don't need this information. I mean, they're living it. And so Moses is recording this for the generations that will not have a cloud. So where do you go for faithful directions? That's the question I have for the class. And we can talk about that. Obviously, we go to the Word of God. We go to responsible, growing, mature, Spirit-filled Christians. We go to circumstances and see how God is moving us by those circumstances and how do they line up with the way He's worked in our lives. We go to church. We go to our pastor. We go to our Bible teacher. There are numbers of avenues that God can use to speak to us about the direction He has for our lives. Now, the last point is active obedience. And I mentioned this earlier. Notice how the text is building in terms of its emphasis. In verse 21, it's one evening. In verse 22, sometimes they stay 2 days. Sometimes they stay a month. Sometimes they stay longer. The repetition of thought highlights the exact obedience to God's direction. Here's a description of active obedience. Active obedience. It's not a passive state, nor is it mere compliance without understanding. Active obedience is not a passive state, nor is it mere compliance without understanding. Rather, active obedience means choosing day by day to listen, respond, and act with faithfulness, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. Now, let me give you a case study. This week, I was watching a Western. It's an old Western. I'd never heard of this series, Zane Grey Western series, back in the 1950s. And I'm asking the class to consider this situation and I'm going to ask them to speculate how the story concludes from the 1950s. And I'm going to ask them, do they think the story would conclude differently in 2025? So here's the story, very briefly. There's a man in this Western town who's a gunslinger. It's a fast draw. And he's a bully, and he's picking on people. And the episode starts with him gunning down an old man doesn't have a chance. He asks for somebody to count to 7. And there's a young boy there that counts to 7 because he's very eager about that. And the doctor, who's the hero in the movie, comes around the corner just after this happens, and the man is dead. He tells the boy, who happens to be his son, to go home. The men of the community, the leaders, meet together about what are they going to do about this this fast draw, this gunslinger, and they want to hire another gunslinger to come in and take him out. But the doctor speaks against that and says that he thinks that what's wrong is there is a sickness in this man, a mental sickness, a background sickness, and so he wants to take the chance to possibly deal with this man. So he goes home, and his son that he sent home had already eaten and skipped out and had gone back into town. And he's not happy about that. And he wants to talk to the wife about this boy being disciplined. And we learn that the boy is the biological son to the wife, but he's not the biological son to the father, who's the doctor. And the man says, I've willingly stayed out of that and haven't disciplined him, but now he needs a man's discipline. Well, about that time, the door flies open, and the men of the city carry in a man who's been shot. They put him on the operating table. When the doctor turns the light on, it's the gunslinger, and this creates the crisis. What the townsmen want the doctor to do is just let the man die. But the doctor refuses to do that. He says, he's my patient, and I need to do the very best I can for my patient. And they put more pressure on him. This is the solution to our problem. Just let him die. And the doctor refuses to do that. And the men say, if you save this man's life, we are going to drive you out of town. You're done in this town. And so the doctor still insists on helping this man. The son comes into the room a little bit later, and he's telling the stepfather, would you do for my mother and me what you did to the townspeople? That is, would you cave in? And the father says, what are you talking about? And we come to find out that the one who actually shot the man that was killed, that shot the gunslinger, was the boy. They were in a livery stable. A man came in to get his wagon. This gunslinger threw a rope on him, teasing him. And this man was tired of it, and he went to shoot the gunslinger. The gunslinger didn't see what was happening, but the boy did. And the boy shot the man, not intending to kill him, but he killed him. And so that changes the story. The mother finds out about it, and she begins to put pressure on her husband to let the man die. So that's the case that's before him. So how do you suppose that was resolved in 1950? That's what I'm asking the class. Now, do you think there was a different resolution if that story been told in 2025? Now, maybe not, maybe so. But my point that I'm driving at is could it be that if you said there'd be a different outcome in 2025, it's a reflection that our society is no longer following the guidance of God? We are given daily guidance to his people, and sometimes we're placed in very difficult situations, but we are to be obedient despite the ease or the difficulty of it. Now, to close the lesson, we all are familiar with the GPS, and I want to use GPS as an acrostic to summarize this lesson. So, for example, I write GPS on the board, and what does the G stand for? And I'll have them give me suggestions. It could be God's presence shown. Something else I have is give plans to the Spirit, or go purposeful and sensitive. They'll come up with all, but my basic idea of wanting to drive into their mind the fact that we follow a GPS in order to arrive at our destination, and God gives us daily guidance to his people because he has purposes that we may not even see, but he's leading us to a direction. I think you're going to enjoy your study of the book of Numbers. Thank you so much for being a part of this.